Hillsdale. Dr. Kopff, would you please come forward?
Thank you for that introduction, and it's great to be here. This has been a wonderful meeting. The quality of the presentation, the presenters, the people attending, the discussions have all been quite wonderful. I'm not sure that a cool day in the summer in St. Louis quite meets a cold day in hell, but it's also rare, let's put it that way. So I think we're very grateful that we've had both the time together and the weather we've had also. I'm also pleased to be representing the state of Colorado here. As you know, our recent legal decisions involving the redefinition of marriage and the legalization of marijuana has allowed our laws to finally restore an important part of the biblical law code as found in the book of Leviticus. You'll remember the verse, if two men lie together, they must be stoned. Well, some people think we're not strong Bible believers in Colorado. That's quite wrong. Complete misinterpretation of our legislature in that regard. So last summer I was a delegate to our Missouri Synod Convention, and I also was on a floor committee involving the universities and the seminaries. And as a result, I got to meet a lot of people I wouldn't have met before, a lot of pastors over there. And one of the items that struck me in discussions that would take place over breakfast or during lunch or after dinner was a certain stage a pastor would sort of look down with an uncontrollable feeling of pride and say more or less, my son's been accepted by Hillsdale. And the first time I just thought this was somebody I met. After a while it began to catch on. And frankly, even last week when I was in Rockford attending and speaking at the Rockford Institute summer program, which was on Dante's Commedia, the Divine Comedy there, I met an old friend of mine, and who's a Lutheran, who's a Missouri Synod Lutheran who lives there. And I had seen her daughter just before in Austin at the meeting of the Society for Classical Learning. She's now running a classical school. And Jean Heisey told me, yes, she sort of got her vocation when she was in college. You know, she was accepted at Hillsdale. And it began to sink in that Hillsdale has assumed a certain status, not just among the standard American conservatives, but also among Missouri Synod Lutherans. And it caused me to think about why this was so, what was happening. I met George Roche once or twice. I've met Larry Arndt a number of times. Larry's quite frank about saying that he talks to the presidents of other private schools and they want to know how they can be as successful as Hillsdale, and he tells them. And they respond, my board wouldn't let me do that. My board wouldn't let me do that. So at this point in our movement, I wonder if it isn't time to start thinking about college. Certainly when you're talking about education, it's important to understand the foundations. And it's important to understand the goal. And I think these are areas that classical educators in general and Lutheran classical educators in particular are good on. 15 years ago, you could say a lot of people were confused about what was foundational. Today, a lot of people understand the trivium, they understand grammar, logic, and rhetoric. We had great presentations on them here, and I've heard great presentations at other classical conferences. We understand that you need a proper academic foundation. I think we spend a little less time talking about the goal, which is educating people for vocation. We know that some of our Catholic friends have difficulties here because John Henry Newman spoke in ways that either were confusing or, as we sometimes say, not helpful about vocational training. But I think because of Dr. Wies, we understand the role of vocation in the Christian life. We understand its importance on the kingdom of the left hand. We know why education matters in that regard. A lot of people in schools, and my own school is guilty of this too, are wondering what jobs students are going to have. We know that it's more than a question of jobs. It's a question of vocations. And of all classical educators, my impression is that Lutheran classical educators understand best the foundational aspect, why we need to teach what is basic and make sure they know it before we move on. And we also understand where we're heading ultimately. The middle levels, we're now getting, I know a number of our schools are now getting ready to start high schools. Some of them have already started them. There are some wonderful classical high schools out there. Some of them are fairly new, some of them older. Society for Classical Learning was in Austin, and there we saw a Regent School. Austin, a fine older one. If you ever go to Long Island, where my school was, a short distance away, Chaminade Catholic School, is a wonderful classical school in Mineola, Long Island, and continues to do the job it did when I was a boy there, attending nearby St. Paul's School in Garden City, which they did by a very interesting curricular decision. They didn't change their curriculum. When I was going by, Garden City is next to Mineola. School I went to was next to Mineola, and that was considered. Chaminade was considered a good parochial school. I mean, local people were proud to go there. It's not a parochial school anymore. It has dorms. People come from all over New York. You have to have a baptismal certificate to get in. When they did an article on it in the New York Times a couple of years ago, you knew how good it was because the Archdiocese of New York, the Catholic Archdiocese, apologized for it. They assured the New York Times most of their schools weren't that way. They were very open to anyone else to come. And they didn't insist on a rigid curriculum. And you could attend 12 years and never take Latin. So it wasn't as bad as it seemed. The fact is that these schools continue to do a great job. We're getting ready to move into a high school level, many of them. And when you reach high school, you think about college. Probably a lot of us disagree with the idea that everybody should go to college. It's not true. But some people should go to college. Colleges are important. College is an important part of education. It's also true within our own tradition that in a very real sense, university was the beginning of Luther's reforms. First thing he did when he started teaching and got, in our terms, tenure at the University of Wittenberg was to reform the university curriculum in a humanist direction. And he was proud of this fact. Aristotle got moved down a notch. Dialectic, which had assumed a senior position in the trivium during the High Middle Ages, was moved back into second place, so that rhetoric, all persuasion, but especially, of course, preaching, assumed its position as the third and top goal. And, of course, he hired the young man considered the most brilliant young humanist in Europe, the northerner who could almost stand up and perhaps could stand up to Erasmus, Philip Melanchthon. Terrific faculty decision, we'll all agree. It's sometimes misunderstood that that is what Luther was spending his time doing, was reforming the university curriculum in his school in a humanist direction, in a classical Christian direction. And I regret to say a lot of good lives of him don't make this clear. There's a very good German one by a German scholar named Volker Leppin, L-E-P-P-I-N, called, of course, Martin Luther, which makes this quite plain, spends 4 or 5 pages going over what he was doing. It's what we need to start thinking about so that we don't get to a situation where everybody is now moving to high school, getting high school students, and we haven't thought about the curricular direction of our colleges and where they should go. Of course, there's Hillsdale, and it's clear talking to confessional Lutherans, to confessional Lutheran pastors, that that's taken very, very seriously. So let me talk just a minute about some things that are good about it, and then try to round up our thoughts on this subject. This is going to be a theoretical discussion. It's going to be about things that work, not necessarily how we can get there directly, but we need to be thinking about goals. I think it's important that we do so. Of course, everyone knows one aspect of Hillsdale. It goes back to George Roche, who made the fantastic decision not to accept federal aid, to found his school on the tuition and fundraising. And there's no question that this was allied to having a direction for the school, a philosophy for the school, an idea behind it that faculty and students got to understand. One of my visits there 4 or 5 years ago happened to be just after alumni weekend. And I assure you, it was somewhat amusing to see the older alumni of Hillsdale come back to a school they hardly recognized. Used to be a place, there are many small private schools like this, where the less talented younger sons of successful families would go. And by the way, there's a role for that in our educational system, no question about it. And they go to this school now, it's full of these quite brilliant young people who are taking courses from faculty who, in any other world system, would be teaching at large universities. And the philosophy that is there permeates the school. Of course, it permeates other schools too, and other schools have morale. Also, I don't mean to deny it, but it is quite striking when you walk around campus early in the morning and you walk by the statues of George Washington and Thomas Jefferson, and then of Margaret Thatcher, and you time for coffee, so you go in the student union and the coffee is there and the TV set is on. Turn to Fox News. I remember thinking, I couldn't resist, although he wasn't there, thinking, you know, Toto, I don't think we're in Boulder anymore. And it was hard to resist. Not that Boulder doesn't have its own morale in a way. I didn't want to put morality on the end, but its own distinctive idea. One of the issues I think we need to take seriously, I'm going to talk about two especially. One of them is what is expected of faculty. Probably the biggest change I've seen in 40 years of teaching is when I started teaching, the expectation was that a faculty member was a teacher scholar. That teaching was important, that scholarship was important, that your scholarship made your teaching better, and your need to teach made your scholarship better. It was not only, it was said explicitly, but it was also understood. And it was understood in the sciences, as in the social sciences, as in the humanities. Those days are gone. People who talk that way are my age. It's now understood that there are productive scholars who publish, and there are instructors who we bring in to teach. And they teach a lot, and they're judged by their student evaluations, one of the least successful discoveries of the social sciences, as far as measuring how good people really are, how effective they are. One of the things that going to Hillsdale gives you, again, is the fact that that's the way their faculty is. They teach, they're excited about teaching, they publish books. Now you can say, being out in the middle of nowhere is a strong incentive for publishing, not to mentioning their productivity in the more family side of things, which is quite impressive among the very few faculties have as many children as the faculty at Hillsdale. It's interesting to see, but what is more important is really the fact that there is the old idea that a teacher and a scholar were the same thing, and that they strengthened one another, and it wasn't sabotaging your teaching when you were publishing, and it wasn't sabotaging your publications when you talked to bright students. Of course, part of that is the bright student. First time I was invited to Hillsdale for one of their conferences, which they use both to enliven the intellectual life of the community, but also they invite the donors to these events. And it was on rhetoric, and I was speaking on Richard Weaver, a very important American conservative thinker who spent his whole life teaching in the writing program at the University of Chicago. He was not in the English department. Not only did he spend his whole academic career in the writing department, it was even more shameful than that. In the 1940s, he won a teaching award. I mean, that can be the end of your academic career if you're a serious scholar nowadays. And the first person to speak was someone from the Claremont system. The term West Coast Straussian means anything to you, otherwise you may ignore it. And he gave a talk on Aristotle. He was very competent and academically sound. And then question time came. One of the students came up and asked a question, and the speaker stared at him for about a minute. It got to be embarrassing. And then he leaned forward and said, "I've been teaching this for over 20 years to graduate students. I've never heard that question before." That's the difference between teaching people who depend on you to get the job and whose job it is to figure out what you think and give it back to you, and students who have a real liberal arts education, where you're taught to think, where you hear a talk and you can respond to it immediately with a relevant question that stretches the person who's asking it, or in this case, flabbergasted the person who was asking it. Because one of the things people who teach in graduate programs tell themselves is, we're teaching the best. These poor undergraduates, we'll let the instructors teach the undergraduates. The fact is, bright undergraduates are brighter than most people who go to graduate school. Not all, of course. Not all, of course. And then there's the further side of what we need in a school. And we've talked about this now, but it's one of the great contributions that classical education is making, even to those who don't like it, even those that want to think about it, which is the balance of trivium and quadrivium in the 7 liberal arts. The arts of language and the arts of mathematics. And that an educated person is educated in both of them. On the basic level, grammar, arithmetic, onto the logic level, dialectic and geometry, and then onto the creative level of rhetoric in one, and music, but also astronomy, and I assume other sciences in today's world on the other. And it is a serious problem in today's academia for reasons that we all know. Let me mention something I've written on recently on this, because last May, the Michigan State University, that distinguished institution, had its graduation, and there were things that interested those committed to the institution. There was a honorary degree, a science of doctorate given to one of their graduates who was the first non-physician to serve as CAO of the Mayo Clinic. An Indian businessman, Azim Primji, was a graduate of Stanford's engineering school and turned his family business, West Indian Vegetable Products, into an international IT company, got the doctorate in humane letters. And in terms of humane letters, the interest to me was the fact that it was also the occasion of the graduation of the last classics major at MSU. The president of the school, Luana K. Simon, didn't talk about classics, but she talked about the school's direction. Quote, "During your time as undergraduates, Michigan State University has boldly recast its land-grant mission to meet new challenges and opportunities and to innovate our future," end quotes. And that meant suspending classics, American studies, retailing, geological science and veterinary technology had also been targeted but were reprieved. You can probably see the pattern that's developing here. Increasingly, American schools are not only not teaching a balance of the arts of language and the arts of mathematics, they are systematically headed toward elimination of those goals of language, thinking, and persuasive speaking, which, by the way, are essential for a society that has consensual institutions. When the wonderful American historian Clinton Rossiter described colonial college education, he said its goal was to train students to think, communicate, and lead. To think, communicate, and lead. And its further goal was to cultivate reason, virtue, honor, and the love of liberty. Well, it turns out that we don't really need that anymore. We all know the reasons why it's said anyhow. As William Butler Yeats said, everyone knows or else should know that the STEM pipeline is growing dry. And STEM is the other side's quadrivium: science, technology, engineering, and mathematics. And the United States is going to suffer from debilitating workforce shortages in STEM areas, and we won't be able to compete in the global marketplace, and we need to do something now. In 2005, 3 different expensive reports appeared explaining how America was sinking beneath the waves. In fact, one of them was even came from the executive arm of our national academies, Rising Above the Gathering Storm, energizing and employing Americans for a brighter economic future. One of the reports said its goal was to double the number of science, technology, engineering, and mathematics graduates by 2015. The Rising Above the Gathering Storm crowd even voted unanimously that the committee members participating in the preparation of this report feel that our nation's outlook is dire. The gathering storm increasingly appears to be a Category 5. Sounds pretty bad, doesn't it? Almost as terrifying as the global warming warnings we get. A few years later, Lindsay Lowell of Georgetown, Hal Saltzman of Rutgers published an analysis of the empirical evidence on performance of America's K-12 STEM students and supply of the STEM workforce. They found there was approximately twice as many of these people produced as there were jobs for them. Of course, there's no question that American science education could be better on all levels. But as far as producing people who can do the work, we're doing, in fact, a rather good job at it. This year, 2014, Michael S. Teitelbaum published at Princeton Falling Behind, a study of the same issue, and showed again that the pattern is clear. There's no 100% agreement, because some people think we're producing twice as many STEM workers as we need, and some people think we're producing 3 times as many as we need. So there is a debate. I don't want to suggest there's no debate. But there's no objective evidence that we're failing to. Furthermore, Teitelbaum shows this is part of a pattern in our history since World War II, in which we have these crises in science education that turn out not to exist, create a bubble, and then burst, hurting the people who are lured into these areas. The, of course, iconic instance was the uproar that followed the Soviet launching of Sputnik on October the 4th, 1957. Just a few days later, Elmer Hutchinson, director of the American Institute of Physics, told the New York Times in their October 8th issue, unless the U.S. revamped its education system to emphasize science, quotes, our way of life is, I am certain, doomed to rapid extinction, end quotes. Well, naturally, being faced with rapid extinction, our national government got to work on these things and did all the valuable things we know they did during the 1960s. It's also the budgetary aspect of the environment in which the study of high school Latin went from 728,000 in 1962 to barely 150,000 by the late 1970s. Interesting thing is, crises like this have been predicted before. The great historian of America's classical heritage, Carl Richard, in his book, he wrote a book on the founders and the classics, also a wonderful book on the golden age of classics, which he calls the 19th century, has shown that these attacks came during the 18th and 19th century as well, and they always fell on deaf ears. It wasn't until the 1960s that we started pouring money into these things in a way that undermined the teaching of the humanities and the arts of language. And certainly the things that happened in the 60s were not due to the money that was put into education, because the people who took part in it had been educated earlier, and some of them, as we know, in another country that I won't mention its name, but we know which one I'm talking about. Teitelbaum shows that today's STEM graduates are facing serious unemployment or underemployment when the STEM bubble bursts, as has happened 4 times already since World War II. But there's really, the more important point to us, I think, isn't will people find jobs. I've said this already. Consensual institutions and the religion of the Bible require educated citizens who can read and speak and write grammatically, think logically, and express themselves convincingly, which are the goals of the arts of language, grammar, logic, and rhetoric, or, as Clinton Rossiter put it, to think, communicate, and lead. The decision of academic leaders like MSU's president and so many others across this country will not only lead to producing too many STEM workers, which is too bad for them, but the implosion of the humanities is undermining the possibility of free institutions, creativity, and our access to our great religious tradition in area after area. I don't mean to set up MSU as a straw man here. Frankly, it was the school Russell Kirk resigned from in disgust in 1953, so it's not exactly news that this school does not have a strong commitment to the arts of language. However, it does raise the question raised by the great American conservative Albert J. Nock, who asked, how would you know if we were living at the beginning of a dark age? Technological innovation won't tell us. 7th century Europe had better plows than the classical world did. There were new inventions like the tidal mill and stirrups for riding horses, but literacy declined and cities shrank or disappeared. Decisions to eliminate the liberal arts are neither bold nor innovative. And merely holding the line on mediocrity isn't either. We need to think seriously about a school that can do for our students and other students like them what Hillsdale is now doing for its students. Decisions to eliminate or marginalize the liberal arts, the arts of language as we know them, are neither bold nor innovative. They're reckless and irresponsible. Once the number of schools making them reaches a critical mass, there'll be no turning back. The last classics major at MSU, Andrew Crocker, told his local newspaper, "I'm hoping the university will come to its senses." I think he's right. It's a question of sanity. If you know your Latin, quem Deus vult perdere, whom God wants to destroy, insaniat, he makes mad. And throwing away our traditions in the arts of language, in the liberal arts, in the ability to read the languages of the Bible and the languages of the Lutheran confessions, German and Latin, by the way, that would be a terrible decision. But finding a school that does for our students what Hillsdale is already doing for some very bright ones. We won't have to worry about a lot of competition. Most schools will not follow. But it means that when things get tough for our country, we will have the leadership we need who will be able to speak grammatically, think logically, and then express themselves convincingly to the people of our country on subjects that are religious and subjects that are political and social. And that, I think, is a great goal for our movement, and I hope you'll agree with me it's one worth taking seriously, thinking about, and working toward as we continue to work in our schools. Thank you for your kind attention.
Thank you, Dr. Kopff. I move that we establish a committee to explore... No, just kidding. Maybe I shouldn't be kidding. Thank you. I would like to close with simply singing the common doxology. But before we do that, I want to ask for announcements. Are there any announcements? Yes, Mrs. Dr. V. Oh, yeah, that's right.
One of the exciting things that we can do at the banquet is to celebrate with the schools and individuals that achieve great success during the year. And this year we have had 2 schools complete the accreditation process. The board has approved and their application, their self-study, the site visit, And so we're adding 2 more schools to our group of accredited classical Lutheran schools. I'm not sure whether anyone from Mount Olive is here. Is anyone from Mount Olive, Billings, Montana, here? Well, I want to take a minute to brag on Mount Olive because both of the schools we're going to recognize tonight have a unique achievement that the board has managed to, has approved, and that is Mount Olive, or the board this year decided to recognize exemplary practices. And so now when a school goes through the process, if there is a particular area in which they are exceptionally well organized and really achieving highly in, the team that visits them can indicate that, and the board can choose to recognize the school with an exemplary practice. And Mount Olive will be recognized for exemplary, all of you administrators are going to be so jealous, exemplary administrative policies. So they really do have some excellent policies. If you are a school that's interested in pursuing this, they would be the school to contact. So I do want to commend Mount Olive, and we'll be sending them their plaque. So Billings, Montana. Okay. The other school that we want to recognize also has a rather unique characteristic because it is a secondary school. That's our first secondary school. It also is our first online school. So Wittenberg Academy completed their second year of operation. They completed it and celebrating it by having a self-study and a prolonged site visit, which was over 2 weeks long, that we were attending their courses electronically. After writing the report on it and recommending it to the board has approved their accreditation status. So again, I would like to recognize Wittenberg Academy, and I know that we have Wittenberg Academy people here. Would you stand up, please? Mr. and Mrs. Benson, would you like to come up and get the plaque?
Ask Paul King to take a picture. Pastor King.
Pastor King, can you take a picture?
We have the Consortium for Classical Lutheran Education present to you. Let me read the plaque from the microphone. The plaque reads, "The Consortium for Classical and Lutheran Education has approved accreditation for Wittenberg Academy, having satisfactorily demonstrated the marks of a classical and Lutheran school, CCLE XIV, July 2014. I was one of the visitors for the Wittenberg Academy, and I was also one of the reasons why we had to extend 2 weeks into the visitation. My computer skills were so poor, it took me a week just to figure out which buttons to punch to make something happen. After that, I discovered a wonderful education, so congratulations, Wittenberg Academy, and also to your many fine teachers who I know are here. You have a fine faculty from all over. One of the great benefits of having an online school is you can get the best teachers in the United States and outside to teach in your school. Are there other announcements? Yes, Pastor Heine.